Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that tries to make history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. So, it feels like it's been a while since I did an episode on something exploding. When was the last time? Was it the Indianapolis? Yeah, I think it was the sinking of the Indianapolis. So today, I want to talk about another explosion, but this time of the Hindenburg Airship in 1937. The Hindenburg was a type of airship known as a Zeppelin, not the band. This particular model was commissioned to ferry passengers back and forth between the US and Germany, and more specifically in the US to the Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey. But on its second of 10 planned trips, the thing caught fire and exploded over the Lakehurst base as it was about to land, killing 36 of the 97 people on board. So today, I want to go over that incident. First, as always, we'll start with some historical context. When were airships popular, and why were they popular? We'll take a good look at the history surrounding the popularization of airships like the Hindenburg Zeppelin to get a better understanding of why people were flying around in these things in the first place. After we've got the historical context squared away, we'll take a look at the incident itself. How did it catch fire? What happened? Was it human error or just a horrible, horrible accident? And what were the short term and long term consequences of the Hindenburg disaster on flying and, more generically, the airship industry? So, let's get started. So, the first question I had was, when were airships first built? We can date airplanes back to the beginning of the 20th century, that's the 1900s, so how about things like Zeppelins and blimps? Well, actually, they came first. The first airship, also called sometimes a dirigible or a dirigible balloon, and in this case it was a blimp, took flight in 1852. It was a French physicist named Henry Giffard. Giffard? You know me, I don't do French. Henry Giffard who built and flew it. Now, before I get too carried away here, the difference between a blimp and a Zeppelin is essentially its guts. A Zeppelin has an internal framework, usually made of aluminum so it's not too heavy, and that's what keeps its shape. It's rigid. It's known as like a rigid airship. A blimp doesn't have that internal structure. It holds its shape through air pressure, very much like a hot air balloon does. You fill it up with the gas, right, with the air, and that's what gives it its shape. Doesn't have that metal structure. Zeppelins also use metal rings to help form shapes with some crossbars to keep everything in place, and then they stretch some cotton canvas over the outside. Boom, airship, right? Now, the first airship, the one built by the Frenchie, was steam powered. It had a 350-pound engine capable of turning one large propeller. It's pretty heavy, actually. To counteract this, the Frenchman put a 144-foot-long bag filled with hydrogen in there. He took off from Paris and went about 20 miles, going at a speed of 6 miles per hour. And for my metric system friends, that's roughly 30 kilometers at a speed of 10K per hour. Not crazy fast, but speed was not the point of the exercise. It was the ability to fly and control movement in the air. That's what mattered. And humans had found a way of flying using machines to get airborne. But we also know that the Wright brothers built and flew an airplane in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, right? 1903, I think it was. So, based off of the type of flying vehicles we have today, we know that the plane is the one that survived. But airships didn't, at least not in a major commercial way. So, why don't we see as many blimps, zeppelins, and other dirigibles in the 21st century? Well, first, we have to take a look at the golden age of airships to get a better explanation. Of the many men who built and or operated airships, a really successful one was a German named Ferdinand Count von Zeppelin. He built his first airship in 1900, and it was far superior to the earlier French models. His airship, called the LZ-1, was 420 feet long, 38 feet wide. It had that rigid aluminum frame that's typical of Zeppelins instead of blimps, and two 16 horsepower engines, which could get it to a speed of around 20 miles per hour. So a little bit faster, but still not breaking any speed records, right? Throughout World War I, von Zeppelin continued to hone his aircraft designs, now called Zeppelins, of course, named after him, and they saw combat. Many Zeppelins bombed Paris and London in World War I. And after World War I, more airships were built. And since Germany saw so much success, other countries started to follow suit, most notably in the US, the UK, and Italy. And fun fact, I've actually, albeit briefly, mentioned this. If you listen to my episode on the deadly Antarctic explorations, you may remember that Roald Amundsen, the first man to reach the geographic South Pole, among many other things, was also the first man to fly to the North Pole in an Italian airship in 1926. So, if anything, this tells us that the airship technology was improving over time, still very popular in the first half of the 20th century, and used regularly during that interwar period between World War I and World War II. An airship named the Graf Zeppelin served from 1928 to 1937, and in those 9 years, it made 590 flights. 144 of them were oceanic crossings. So clearly, the airship industry is doing pretty well. So, why did the Graf Zeppelin get decommissioned in 1937? Well, it was the Hindenburg Disaster, which took place the same year, and it had massive consequences for the world of blimps and Zeppelins. But I'll get to that in a little bit. So, the Germans in general were excellent at building Zeppelins. It was a proven military technology in World War I, arguably not anywhere as incredible as, let's say, the British Mark I tank, right? Pioneered by the Brits at the Battle of the Somme. However, the blimp, the Zeppelin airships were still a valuable military technology, and so futuristic. Bombing from the air, which was something new and novel in war. And the military class Zeppelins used in World War I were capable of flying up to 85 miles an hour and could carry up to 2 tons of bombs. So certainly the technology had progressed from those early days of 6 miles an hour, right? But if you ask me, and of course I'm speaking from a 21st century perspective, I would much rather fly in an airplane than a Zeppelin. Airplane technology was also a thing in World War One. We know that planes were used in World War One as well, right? But there was just something so German about the Zeppelins and the airship industry. Those rigid dirigibles. That's a fun band name. Rigid dirigible. Those rigid dirigibles that were pioneered by a great German general and used so effectively in war alongside airplanes. But after World War One, the Zeppelin industry in Germany was in crisis, and this is because of the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, which severely punished and blamed Germany for World War I. And in the Treaty of Versailles, one of the many provisions was to limit Germany's military forces. Only 100,000 men in the army, 15,000 in the navy, and a restriction on the number and size of ships. And concerning their fleet of airships, Article 198 of the Treaty of Versailles states, and I quote, "The armed forces of Germany must not include any military or naval air forces. No dirigible shall be kept." End quote. To further illustrate the point, Article 202 states, and this time I'm just paraphrasing, that all German airships must be delivered to the Allied forces as part of its reparations payments. Now, there were some attempts in the ensuing years to build civilian airships to try to get around this, but the Allied powers kept demanding that they turn them over, any newly built Zeppelins, over. Von Zeppelin's successor, a man named Hugo Echner, did manage to find a way around this in 1924 by building airships for the Americans. They'd been building Zeppelins of their own, like the USS Shenandoah airship, but they were interested in getting Echner, the German Zeppelin builder, to help them build even more. The Germans had to pay for building these airships, which is wild, but the Americans would deduct that from the reparations payments. And since I keep mentioning the war reparations, total little side tangent here, my favorite random statistic about all of these reparations that Germany finally did finish, and it was $33 billion, by the way, worth of World War I reparations. They finished paying them off in 2010. Yep, 2010. That's 33 billion in US dollars. by the way, in 1919 money. So they finished paying that in 2010, almost 100 years later. That's crazy. But anyway, even though it was an airship for the Americans, the Germans were happy to be back in the Zeppelin building business. It's something they had been doing for the entire century by that point. But more than back, they were on top. But the bigger picture here is that the airship relationship between the US and Germany had begun. It was strong, it was happening, it's here. And now, Zeppelin flights are regularly going back and forth across the Atlantic between US and Germany. And here's an interesting tangent, and this time it is related, I promise. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he actually used Zeppelins as part of his powerful propaganda machine. All German Zeppelins had a swastika painted on the tail fin, and they'd occasionally float around above German towns dropping leaflets. One such leaflet, dropped in March 1936, so the year before the Hindenburg disaster, had the following selection from one of Hitler's speeches, quote, I once undertook a 14-year struggle to get the German people to agree with my ideals. Then, thanks to their trust in me, I was summoned by the Honorable General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. But since then, I have directed all my energy to achieving the glorious state of consciousness of being inseparably connected to my people as man and as Führer. End quote. And it was more than just a propaganda machine. Under Hitler's Germany, a new class of Zeppelin was built, the Hindenburg class of Zeppelins. The Hindenburg was the new flagship of this class, named after, of course, Paul von Hindenburg, the president of Germany before Hitler's takeover. You might recognize him from history class. He's the one that had that really swoopy mustache. It's cool facial. I'm partial to facial hair. It's because of my last name. But anyways, let's talk about the Hindenburg. I've got tea today. These new Hindenburg class Zeppelins were huge, the largest ever built. I'm getting strong Titanic vibes here. The largest of its type, totally safe and not going to be a massive technological disaster and display of hubris. Just saying. Now, like previous Zeppelins, the Hindenburg had a massive metal frame with canvas stretched over top. Inside were 16 large latex bags designed to be filled with helium. But the Germans couldn't get helium because it's a non renewable resource that was more or less only being extracted in the US at this point, and the US wasn't trading it internationally at the time. So instead, the German Zeppelin industry, and in fact most European Zeppelin industries, were using hydrogen, which is a major, major red flag. Helium is not flammable, can't burn, which is great for your floating airship. Hydrogen is flammable, which you might have already known if you listened to my previous episode on Fukushima. The explosions at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant were hydrogen explosions. And hydrogen is also much cheaper to produce en masse to fill airships with, which is why many European nations used it. The US used to use it too until they had their own airship explosion in 1921, so they switched to helium. But Germany didn't have that luxury, so they used hydrogen gas. Now, since the Hindenburg was built as a passenger airship, it had quite a luxurious design for the time. It could accommodate up to 70 passengers. In the lower decks, it had cabins that were 5 feet by 8 feet with 2 different bunks arranged like bunk beds. Each cabin had a stool, a wash basin with plumbed in cold and warm water, a shelf, a stand-in closet. The walls were made of percale, which is a woven fabric that's often used to make sheets and stuff. So, I mean, pretty decent accommodations for a floating airship, right? I mean, it's way better than what we get flying commercial airliners today, right? Now, also on this lower deck were showers, toilets, a bar, and a smoking room, which is the last thing I would want on an airship that floats because of a flammable gas. So, yikes. No smoking room on board flammable air machine, please. Thank you very much. And side note on the smoking, actually, passengers that had anything that could potentially ignite was taken off them during takeoff. This would include camera equipment with their hot flash bulbs, right? But they would get that back when they cleared any land, when they were over the open ocean. But why give it back at all? That seems like a bit of an oversight. I feel like it should have just been kept by the staff for the duration of the flight and given to them when they're no longer in a floating flammable machine. But anyways, There were these horizontal windows along the edge of the lower decks so passengers could get a good look straight down. And the view is not for those who are afraid of flying. Like how terrifying. Just a straight window looking all the way down to your death. Now, above the lower decks, in the upper decks, if you will, were the dining room and the lounge. And they were actually pretty posh for the time. Can you imagine flying in a plane, but having the space to sit dozens of people down at an actual dining room table and be served an actual hot meal? Must be nice. Now, if you could already guess, this travel was for the rich. Like this is fancy stuff. Each ticket for the Hindenburg was about 450 US dollars, which in today's money, adjusting for inflation, I plugged it into one of those inflation calculator things, is around $9,800. So pretty pricey. And we know that price because they recovered a slightly charred passenger ticket from the wreckage over in Lakehurst, which is pretty fascinating. The ticket holder, a man named Dolan, unfortunately didn't make it. The surname Dolan does not have a lot of luck on the AFAL podcast. I'm thinking specifically of Patrick Dolan from the Donner Pass episode. He's the one who went out as part of the snowshoe crew to try to find help, but they were all starving, so they drew straws and he pulled the short straw, which meant that he was supposed to die to feed the rest of them. It didn't happen that way, but not a lucky dude. Go listen to that episode if you haven't. That was my first episode, so I'm really partial to that one. Winter exploration gone wrong with cannibalism. It's perfect, right? Now, the windows on these upper decks, unlike in the lower decks where they were horizontal, the windows in the upper decks were a little bit slanted, but you could still peep over and look straight down. Like there were side rails in the restaurant to keep you from falling into it and breaking it, I suppose, but you could still look straight down. And for those on board with steel stomachs, they also gave tours of the cargo deck, the underbelly, if you will. Here's a quote from an account from one of the passengers who did this tour. Quote, "Led by one of the engineers, we were led through a vestibule and then a door and found ourselves upon the catwalk, really the keel of the ship. It is a plank about 1 foot wide extending from tip to tip. The circular ribs of the ship are bound together by wires and cross members, with the walk as sort of a spinal column. Along this path, we walked with nothing in between us and the ocean far below, except the fabric skin of the hull and a few wires and a rope, at which we clutched grimly. Past the crew quarters, repair stations, gas and oil tanks, water cisterns, and storage sections, we crawled. The roar of the motors increased, and beyond, and quite unexpectedly, our guide pulled a cord. Like a window shade, the skin of the ship opened, and then we were looking down 3,000 feet to the sea." End quote. Y'all, now, I'm not afraid of heights. I'm a thrill seeker. I've been skydiving. I've been cliff diving. That stuff doesn't bother me. It's not a problem. I love it. But if I'm flying in a flammable hydrogen balloon made of metal and they open up the bottom of the flap for me to stare down upon my impending doom, I would probably be more than a little anxious. Something about that just is too risky for me. On May 3rd, 1937, the Hindenburg departed for its second of 10 scheduled trips between Germany and Lakehurst, New Jersey. And in addition to 36 passengers that were on board were the captain, Captain Max Pruss, and 60 other crewmen. I also want to mention here that of the 36 passengers, 3 of them were children. Yeah, you know what's coming, right? Now, it was a relatively easy flight. There were some strong headwinds, but nothing outrageous, but it did delay the Zeppelin just a little bit. Normally, the trip would only take 4 days, but with the winds, the Zeppelin was about 8 hours behind on its journey, but that didn't make too much of a difference. They flew across the Atlantic. They got to see some massive icebergs in the north. They flew over Newfoundland, over Boston, and even New York City. Although the city wasn't in the plans, but there were strong winds and storms that forced the captain to reroute over the city. And so I imagine the people below were actually enjoying that view because it wasn't normal to see an airship flying overhead. Now, as the Hindenburg got closer to Lakehurst, the weather was still a problem. It was too stormy to land, so the Hindenburg had to make another pass around to eat up some time. So it decided to take a joyride down the Jersey Shore, which many of the passengers enjoyed, the kids especially. At 6:22 p.m., Captain Pruss got a notification that the storms near Lakehurst Naval Air Station had ended, so he turned around the Zeppelin and headed for the base for landing. By 7 o'clock, the Hindenburg had arrived at its destination, but the storms, although they were gone, the conditions still weren't right and it was still a bit too windy, and it couldn't land right away. The ground crew also wasn't ready for them, and the strong headwinds made it a little dicey, so it was hard for the captain to keep the airship steady. So he made another pass around, this time just looping around the base, to wait it out. And in the meantime, he dumped out a bunch of water from the stern, which is normally used as ballast, to help lighten the load in preparation for landing. So everything is going okay. Everything's going fine, just the way it should. At 7:21, the mooring lines were dropped. These would be picked up by the ground crew and secured so the airship could just safely lower down to the landing target without blowing away. And by this point, the passengers are all excited and ready to get off and head to their final destinations. As part of this Germany US Zeppelin deal, passengers would be bussed over to Newark Airport and then flown off to wherever they needed to go on an airplane. 4 minutes later, 7:25, a blue flash erupted in the sky. This was noted by several people, both on board and waiting on the ground. And as soon as that blue flash was gone, there was an explosion and a fire broke out. It quickly spread across the entire hull of the airship, which was now shaking violently in the air. And within seconds, the whole thing was engulfed in flames. Any people, crew or passengers, in the nose of the ship were killed instantly. Same for anyone in the lower decks, so the rooms, the bar, the smoking lounge. Most of those in the upper decks survived, though some succumbed to some serious burn injuries. So, how did they survive in an airship still on fire in the air? They jumped. Now, those who jumped when the airship was still too high died on impact. Splat, right on the ground. But when the fire weakened the hull of the ship, extra water and fuel kept down there in the cargo deck fell out. So it made the whole thing relatively light, so it just kind of fell down to the ground relatively softly for a metal airship on fire, that is. Now, those who jumped when it was closer to the ground survived, but most of them anyway. Some of them died from massive burns. But I want to talk about what happened to the kids. So there was this lovely family, the Donors. Why does it have to sound like Donners? Anyway, the Donor family on board was the father, Herman, the mother, Matilda, and their three kids, 14-year-old Irene, 10-year-old Walter, and 8-year-old Werner. Although it's probably Werner, but I'm going to say Werner. The kids had a really enjoyable trip, running around like kids do, seeing all the cool things that they would later go home and brag to their friends about, right? Like, what a cool experience. Until, of course, the thing caught fire and was engulfed in flames. The mom was with her three kids in the dining room on the upper deck at the time. The father was not with them. So mom had to make a choice. Do we look for husband or do I get out with my kids? And like most mothers, I assume she chose to get the kids out to safety. She first threw the youngest child, Werner, out the window. Now, don't worry, it was low enough to the ground at this point, so he didn't get smushed on impact. And also keep in mind, this is an active military base with a ground crew there to help, so they were pulling out people from the wreckage as they were jumping out the ship, okay? Anyway, Littlin went first, right out the window. And then Mama threw 10-year-old Walter out the window. And then it was Irene's turn, but she was 14. Too big to pick up and throw at that point. And poor Irene was hysterical. She wouldn't go without her father. So poor mom had to make a Sophie's choice here. Do I stay with my daughter to try to get her to jump and find her dad? Or do I jump out the window and make sure my boys are alive and have a parent to care for them? Do I choose the boys or do I choose the girl? And spoiler for the movie, just like with Sophie's choice, she chose the boys. And sorry for the spoiler, but to be fair, it's been out for more than 40 years, so there we go. Also, good movie. Meryl Streep. You should go watch it. Finish my podcast first. So Mama Matilda jumped out the window and dragged her sons to safety, as far away from the burning wreckage as possible. They were all burned, but they lived. Irene, the 14-year-old daughter, who was left on board the flaming airship, was later found in shock, still on the upper deck, on fire. And I don't mean the ship was on fire. She was on fire. Her hair was burning, her clothes were burning. Others managed to get her up, put out the fire, and get her out of the Zeppelin through one of the windows, but she later died in hospital from some pretty horrendous burns. The father's body was found the next day, and the only way they knew it was him was by the inscription on the inside of his wedding ring. Otherwise, he was burned so badly that he was unrecognizable as anything other than a charred corpse. So, whoops. And to really drive home the point here of how awful the scene was, here's a quote from one of the survivors. Quote, "A moment or two later, as the wrecked ship sank downward, I jumped. The framework of the dirigible pinned me down. I lay flat in the tangle of wreckage, but my body wasn't crushed. I worked frantically to get myself out of the wreckage. I stood up, dazed. The shock had been so great, I didn't know what I was doing. I was navigating without thinking. All around me was the smell of burning flesh." End quote. Within 60 seconds of the first explosion, the Zeppelin was on the ground and completely engulfed in flames. 36 of the 97 people on board died. Many died instantly in the explosion, but some died from fall damage and others from their extreme burns. And you can only imagine how bad burn care was in 1937. They pretty much just had to offer morphine for the pain. They couldn't really do too much about it. Now, to his credit, Captain Pruss stayed on the burning airship until it was virtually on the ground, and he rushed right back into the wreckage to find survivors and to help before he himself was taken out and brought to a hospital. He recovered from his injuries and helped with testimony later on. There was and is no evidence to suggest that he made any critical errors at all. So then what happened? How did the Zeppelin just explode right before landing? One of the survivors, Joseph Spa, was accused of sabotaging it. And he didn't, by the way. He nothing to do with it. But why was this man accused? Well, he was seen going into and out of the cargo hold. And why was he going into and out of the cargo hold? He was traveling with his beloved dog, and he went down there as often as possible to spend time with him. And because he was in the cargo hold, the poor baby didn't survive. Nothing from the cargo hold or the lower decks did. And again, there is no evidence to suggest or corroborate the rumors that Joseph sabotaged the ship. Another man, one of the workers on board, was blamed for planting a timed bomb to destroy the airship after it landed, but because of the 8-hour delay, it went off when the passengers were still on board. But this is also, and was also, just a baseless accusation, rampant speculation, right? So why are people trying to point the finger? Well, nobody wanted to take the blame. So they blamed anyone or anything. The US blamed Germany. Germany blamed the US. The captain blamed this mystery saboteur. The airship builders in Germany blamed it on sabotage or just human error. Nobody wanted to take responsibility because nobody knew what happened. The final report had no evidence of foul play or wrongdoing. Instead, they concluded that it was a combination of a leak in one of the hydrogen sacs and a spark from that still turbulent weather. There was static in the air after the lightning and the storms, and that, coupled with leaking flammable hydrogen, was enough to cause a spark and then an explosion, which then set the whole thing on fire. Some even blamed it on a phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire, not the movie, which is a blue, glowing electrostatic discharge of sorts that can happen around and near thunderstorms or volcanic eruptions. Essentially, the electric field causes air molecules to ionize, which produces that characteristic blue glow around metal objects and such. This could have happened. I mean, people said they saw a blue flash, right? And given the static charge in the atmosphere after the storms, yeah, it could have potentially happened. Alone, it's not an issue, but with leaking flammable hydrogen, it could be a big problem. Now, this disaster was covered extensively. It was even filmed, and the footage is pretty cool. I mean, it was even the album cover for one of Led Zepp's albums, right? The canvas surrounding the shell just disappears. So, as a result, public opinion on the Zeppelins and the airship industry in general shifts. Other German Zeppelins were quickly decommissioned, and despite Zeppelin's collectively and safely logging over 1 million miles of travel, this one incident, again, filmed for everyone to see, completely turned people off to traveling by airship. The German era of airships was now over from this one horrific, terrifying disaster. A few more Zeppelin style airships and blimps were built by the US and the Soviet Union afterwards, but in general, the industry was very much in decline. It didn't help when a Soviet airship crashed into a mountain 1 year later in 1938, killing 3 of the 19 people on board. American airships were used in World War II. They had 10 of them. There wasn't a clear plan of attack for their airship fleet, but they were used to help spot submarines and also be convoy escorts for our naval squadrons. But in the years after this, I suppose, golden age of airships, and in the post war period, commercial airships were just no longer a thing. Airplanes had more or less taken over as the primary airborne passenger transport, and though you will still see blimps being used for things like advertising or surveillance and research, like think of the Goodyear blimp, right? Like they're still kind of around, but not used commercially. It was a horrific disaster, a complete fluke, really, but one that completely ended an entire industry for Germany and changed the fate of our air transport. Now we just fly around on airplanes. But honestly, given the choice, I would rather be in a plane than a Zeppelin, especially if it's a Zeppelin filled with flammable hydrogen. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Hindenburg Disaster. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things. Make sure you subscribe to AFOUT on YouTube, and check out Nedrick Music too. He's the artist behind my intro and my outro song. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.